What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Aaron Staufer. He is the man behind the solidarity circles over at the Winland Cook Center, Vanderbilt Divinity School. And we're going to have a conversation about organizing, grassroots theology, political crisis, democracy, religion, that kind of stuff. And it's going to be a good one. Well, I mean, I know it's going to be a good one because I was there when it was recorded, but you know what I mean. But before we jump in, I just want to let you all know, if you listen to this conversation and say, I'm a part of a faith community, a leader in my local area, and I'd love to get some of the resources of community organizing and process it with a group to help kind of empower, wrestle, reflect on possibilities to do something in the world, then check out Solidarity Circles. This summer, people are applying for the next cohort. In multiple sessions of this, we've had members of the podcast join, and they absolutely loved it. So if you're interested, if your church or your community group get some benefit from working with some amazing people in an online cohort context, check it out. Links will all be attached. Okay. Anyway, and Aaron and the team from Winland Cook are going to be Theology Beer Camp. So I'm just saying, come on out, Theology Beer Camp. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Aaron Staufer, who is a theologian, organizer, and one of the people behind Solidarity Circles, which is a project the Winland Cook Center for Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt runs, along with Jorg Rieger. And excited to have you back on. We were talking about having you back on in part to provide a little hope to lots of people who feel simultaneously overwhelmed by what's going on in the world, and in particular in the American political, cultural scene, and feeling like they lack a lot of agency to do much. In the middle of this situation, you have mainline Protestantism continuing its slow slide into irrelevancy and not knowing what a public voice looks like. There's been data that's come out recently where, other than the Episcopal Church and the UCC, a majority of mainliners who go to church and voted for Donald Trump. And even when we look at the breakdown of say, like the hot button social ethic issues, they tend to be edgy for the 90s. We're going to include women. And in this kind of thing, they just seem generationally beset. Yeah. I like to jokingly call mainline Protestants the Morning Joe of liberalism, because deep down we know the dynamic duo is a former Republican congressperson of the T-Wave and the daughter of an author of the military-industrial complex. But nonetheless, sorry for my venting.
Here we are.
But I'm excited to talk to you about this as someone who's not just a theologian and ethicist, but someone who works regularly in movement work and with the Solidarity Circles, working with faith leaders to figure out what it's like to lead a congregation, to engage, connect, and know their community, to make a difference. So, if you don't do a good job in this conversation, we might all leave depressed, Aaron.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, there's a lot of weight on my shoulders now because of that. Thanks. Really easy task. Yeah. No, yeah, I'm stoked to be here. I mean, we were talking about this before we started. We were at Beer Camp in Denver last year, and we had 2 workshops, and we had a number of people who were attending, and a number of those people have joined the program now and are continuing the relationships that they formed at Beer Camp. We're going to be there again at St. Paul this fall. I've got a number of different colleagues and alumni of the program who are in the Twin Cities area, and so they're stoked to show up to Beer Camp too. So this is a good time to have this conversation. It's just because it's always a good time to have this conversation, right? There's never, now is always a good time to move. So that's yeah, that's good.
So maybe put on your kind of theologian and historian hat for a moment, and I'm interested in, how do you tell the historical trajectory of kind of more progressive expressions of Protestantism in America, where, you have moments like, say, the social gospel movement, where faith leaders and communities end up pressuring government to be, to get things like a 40-hour work week, child labor laws, these kinds of things, to where we are now. Like, as someone familiar with that story, are there particular causal features or turning points that stick out?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question for the church is especially relevant for mainline and for Christians, because progressive forces, the left in general, has never done a really good job of making clear the religious value basis of their work, right? It's always alienated religious people. Religion has always been this sort of folk thing that's not as clear-eyed and smart as secular scientific approach to political change. And so I think if you look across from the 20th century going forward, if you take the social gospel movement, the 1880s onward, that is the story of American democratic socialism that Gary Dorian tells just wonderfully in so many different books, but most presciently within the book of that title, American Democratic Socialism. There's always this odd dance with religious forces, even with Debs at the start. Just the way that he thinks about the value basis commitment to social change and how it's related to the church, the role then of churches in social reform broadly, social movements specifically, and then building economic and political power even more precisely, is one that cuts differently for different churches. Gary has, the way that he tells it is there's 4 different strains of the white social gospel, 4 different strains of the black social gospel. The vast majority of them are democratic socialist, but the best of them are the most radical, the ones who understand the particular institutional role that the church has to play in building up structures of a society that reflect the ethical and religious values that we hold most dear. So I think one of the conversation's point as we think about how did we get here is the role of religion. The right has done a really good job, one, of making clear the religious basis of it, and then building institutions and building media around that. Darren Dochuk's book, From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, is really good in laying this out about how just in the early 20th century, just the mass migration of people and institutions from the South then to California. And then finally, if we think about, because the whole 20th century, we've got the rise of neoconservatism, and then the rise of neoliberalism, and the rise of sort of neo-fascism, all of this. I think the understanding and building strong congregations, strong institutions that can make a difference in their community is a really good thing to keep track of. And when that tends to fall away, the progressive left tends to lose really the American people, I guess, if we're going to say it pretty provocatively. So, I mean, you can see that through the rise of unionism and then the decline of unionism throughout the Cold War, as you go throughout the mid-20th century. But Trip, that's like 150 years you just asked me to sum up now. It's just a lot really quickly. But yeah. I do think religion is really Christianity and attending to strong congregations and broadly being able to articulate why it is that progressives care about religion, why it is that Christians care about progressivism or leftism and broadly.
Yeah, well, one of the features you mentioned there just about institutions in general, mm-hmm. They tend to be having a problem that's not even, just religions, institutions having a problem. And that institutional distrust and the kind of mm-hmm. inherent suspicion Americans mm-hmm. have towards just institutionally mediated forms of cooperation it seems kind of overwhelming, right? And mm-hmm. and one of the ways it sets up discourse both politically and religiously and in other parts mm-hmm. of culture is that leaders or those that come to have a kind of leadership roles or influence mm-hmm. over mm-hmm. Groups of people tend to gain prominence by criticism of the institutions themselves.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right? Be it the political party or the media or dead religion, or it's not a religion, it's a relationship. These kinds of that kind of rhetoric underneath it is one that kind of assumes the trustworthy agent of change is the autonomous, strong individual, right? And you can see that rhetoric that so shaped religion in the growth parts of religion in America and evangelicalism, charismatic movement and stuff, recognizing something in Trump's kind of, getting up at the RNC when he ran the first time and making fun of Jeb Bush over the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
And people going, oh, that's a death knell. Oh, he made fun of John McCain. Oh, who's going to do that? Well, and really, there are a lot of people in those political pews that were like, yeah, this institution does suck, right? And even when you think of where energy came from so often in the Democratic Party, be it on the movement side in places like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Moral Monday movement, looking at the rhetoric that comes there, it's including, even the parties it's most associated with as part of the problem. So, like, I wonder, like, if we kind of like bracket that part of our cultural zeitgeist of looking at just inherent suspicion at institutions and learning the litany our tribe lists off of when institutions go wrong, and go back in time, like, what are some examples and possibilities of institutional movement, community action when, at a time where there was a lot more openness to that kind of collective social project?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to sort of help in this conversation is to kind of like stop using the word institution and start just thinking about community.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Like, let's think about, like, what is an institution besides a networked group of people that live their life together, or a part of their life together, governing it through certain practices and rituals and shared meaning, and then have a certain bureaucracy in order to make sure that they're protecting that, right? Well, that's a community, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
they don't have endowments and
exactly.
And
that's right.
And
it can scale up, right? Yeah. But like, let's just get a low-flying definition of this so that then we can scale that up, because the problems with that, with the sort of authoritarian leadership and the institutional or the individualism and savior leadership, I think stem from when institutions aren't grounded in their community anymore, right? Who it is that they're accountable to. So I think so if we think about, okay, where within mainline Christianity has been really strong examples of community taking action together. Like, the biggest ones we can think about are in the early 20th century. There's so many that we can think about. Let's go back even earlier. One of the better ones is the Knights of Labor, which was a Catholic labor union in the 1880s, 1890s, which was one of the only interracial unions at the time. It was organizing, and it wasn't just skilled labor. It was all workers from whatever color, whatever community, and you can have a leadership in it. And they're going to go organize in the South in doing this. So this was founded and was a Catholic labor union. I mean, it wasn't affiliated with the Catholic Church and the Catholic relationship to labor. It wasn't peachy until later. So it's still complicated today. So it's all, but the founders of it governed their lives, had codes of silence and rituals, all that were grounded within Catholic faith. Let's go then fast forward another 20 or 30 years, look at 1911. Maybe it's actually 1908 if we think of the founding of the FCC. And if you think about some of the main documents that was passed at that founding ceremony here, included fair wages, ending of child labor, limiting to an 8-hour workday, had progressive statements on immigration for that time period. All of that, and that's at a pretty large level of community, right? This is at a national level. The FCC is the predecessor body of the NCC USA, right? The National Council of Churches. And then we can keep on going even farther if we think about some of the best examples of congregations coming together to make a difference. Let's fast forward, let's skip over some of the obvious ones, right? So if we think of the Black Freedom Movement, think about the role of churches and congregations within this. Now, just let me give a quick caveat. The point of saying that congregations were involved in this is not saying that all congregations were involved in this. Many congregations and many churches were not involved in the Black Freedom Movement and were actually openly against it. All of the congregations involved in the movements did not play the same role. So there are different roles that each different community can play. All right, so with that, those sort of every congregation, every pastor has to kind of make a discernment and a judgment call about what are you best suited to do. Okay, and then let's go to the 90s. Let's fast forward really quickly. Let's talk about the interfaith worker justice. Let's talk about the sanctuary movement. Let's talk about the interfaith movement, Religions for Peace. I was the executive director of the national body of that, Religions for Peace USA, for a number of years. So the interfaith movement there is really a wonderful example of that. The best, I think, example that I can give is the one that I was trained in and that I know this, and which we really do and incorporate some of the key trainings and skills in solidarity circles, which is value-based organizing. So if we think, and this is affiliated with the Alinsky style of organizing, if you think about this from 1939 on, Saul Alinsky, Back of the Yards, then we get for the role of congregations within the broad-based community organizing affiliates is essential. It's the organizers there are called institutional organizers. That's actually the way that I was trained in it, because you're there to build and reweave a community to make it stronger in order to build your affiliate, your larger collection of individual institutions, to make them stronger, to make that larger community stronger. And that is still going today. Broad-based community organizing is perhaps the most widely used form of political practice by religious institutions today. Richard Wood and Brad Fulton kind of make that clear in their A Shared Future in their book. So I think that is a whole wonderful, radical, ecumenical interfaith tradition that many of your listeners have local affiliates. Perhaps they just don't even know about in their communities. Now, all this to be said, I mean, Trip, there's also the question of just like, how did you, as a youth pastor in LA, right? Or I can't remember if it was in LA or not. How did you form community? What did you do to give people agency? How did you help them to feel like they were part of a community? That's what it's really about, is about the fact that we're broadly taught that when you're a part of a community, you're not actually here to, you don't actually have a role. You don't actually have any agency. That's wrong. That's the whole point. And I think you know that. That's why people find and love beer camp, home brewed, is because they find voice here.
Just even thinking of the kind of agency you have when you're working with students, be it youth or college students, versus even in that same congregation working with adults. One of the differences is trust. When you're with students, you know, the freedom you have to form what happens when you gather, so that it cultivates a community of radical trust where you learn to let the gift of the tradition, the kind of deep affirmation of a holy, loving, just God that rests upon you and your neighbor and your enemy, like to figure out how do we enact it and embody it. And in that space, then you have a lot more permission to utilize that trust for collective agency, be it experiments we would do like on intense spiritual practice, right? Where then you have parents coming to me because their 16-year-old learned to do contemplative practice, why are my kids wanting to go down to the border for a protest this weekend? Are they going to get kidnapped? Or, insert this kind of thing. And not just me, but lots of clergy I know have had that experience. The moment you become education or senior minister, you realize the people that are coming are not coming because you've cultivated a community of trust where the gospel's at the center and you're trying to wrestle with it. They're coming for a lot of reasons. And now your task is more received, where like they're coming because they want this, and now we're supposed to go give it to them. So if you could learn to be so ambiguous when you say these few topics that are really important to you and Jesus, so that the 2/3 of the room that voted for Trump won't be overwhelmed by them. It'd be a bit cumbersome, to be clear there. And I remember that happening one time where I put in the prayer of confession, There was a new study in LA about like the asthma rates of of the working poor that lived by all the roads that we drive on to our
Yeah.
to our jobs or our graduate degrees, such as what I was doing, and then back to the beautiful place on the beach where we lived. I got as much trouble for putting that in there as including the expanded use of drones under Obama in the prayer of confession when I found out the Raytheon vice president went to our church. And I'm not saying that like, oh, look, that was so good of you, Tripp. It was one of those places where you go, yeah, but we had teenagers reorganizing their lives for solidarity with immigrant kids.
That's right.
And then their parents are like, you want us to confess? Like, sin is overrated. Like, do we even need to say this at church? Same families, right? And so to me, it wasn't for theological reasons that mainline Protestantism forgot that sin is a doctrine and it's not just personal, and that the gospel has deep social, cultural, and economic elements to it, because it was transparently clear to their students when they were just reading the Bible, right? And so then they think, well, we've said Jesus is our Savior and Lord, so what does it mean to take that Lordship seriously? Let's try this. Let's do this. And so I feel like that a lot of congregations and a lot of the clergy and faith leaders who end up in something like solidarity circles have to figure out like, oh, let's not just name what we need to do. We actually have to learn to read our community, not just the people in the community, but the larger community. And then we have to figure out how to narrate our own identity where it connects with the good that is here. And yet the normal way we do value talk tends to be in platitudes. And then we choose a community that platitudes how we want them to, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so one of the gifts of something like youth ministry, it's strikingly similar to what can happen in a solidarity circle, because you don't just come in from on high and make proclamations till the community self-filters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so trust is key to agency, which gives a sense of community, and then that can give birth to natural leadership, right? Leadership is not about the strong man, right? That's the bully, that's the tyrant, and we can analyze that and make clear about why it is that those are socially unjust and horrible roles to occupy in the first place, right? But a real leader is somebody who has earned the deference from their peers. So when you say, okay, Sally's going to be at this Bible study, you're going to go, it's like, yeah, of course I'll be there because Sally's going to be there. Well, clearly this is important because Sally has been at the congregation for 30 years. She defines the church. She's the matriarch of the church. Or we can flip it around and say, all right, well, Steve's going to be there. No, I don't really want Steve. Why is Steve going to be there? I don't really trust Steve. Like that. So I do think that the note here of trust, of forming that, makes clear why it's good to talk about institutions in terms of community, because it's about relationship, and trust and leadership here are two really crucial things that can help you understand why it is that why the stickiness of membership, right? Why does you keep on returning? Not the question of why it is you came to a church is completely different from the question of why it is you kept coming back. That's a different story, right? The why you keep coming back is more important because there are so many other demands on your calendar and your time that can pull you away from it. Now, you mentioned two other things here, which is really important. The sort of shallow value talk and also, which we can talk about here in terms of how it is that mainline Christianity really just has turned into sort of a service organization, both where membership amounts to consumerism and then mission amounts to charity. That's putting it hard because, there are lots of really good congregations out there who see their primary mission as in their outreach budget, which gives a fair amount of money to local organizations all around there. The challenge with that is that that's anti-relational. You don't have any relationship really with the organizations or the nonprofits that you're giving money to, and so then why? And furthermore, then those relationships and those organizations don't have any relationship with your congregation. So why do they care about you? What is integral then to your very story, which is the other thing that you talked about here, is that if you have a different sort of community where you're building up different forms of trust that ground and develop different kinds of leadership, you end up telling a new story about who you are as a group and also your individual role in that. So story is really crucial here. All right, now the final thing I'll say about this is and you have a piece about this that you shared with me, which is really good, about just how mainline Christianity is just theologically shallow, that it's afraid that once you encounter, I think you did this capital W, the word, like that's kind of like, that's too far off, that's a little bit scary, I don't know what that is. I think that this is really important for the broad story of progressivism and liberal or leftist movements today, which is to get clear about the role of sacred history, of God's agency within the movement, of how it is that the Spirit moves you into deeper relationship and with your congregation, and then your congregation out into the community. That is being open to that third movement, right? To the fact that you might actually encounter God, that you might hear a word, is really important. And actually that can give your value talk so much more depth, to say, it's like, yeah, I care about, public education because I don't know how else to talk about my love for my kids besides just the deep, deep well within me, that it just continues and it goes forward. And it's just like, when you experience that sort of value that goes beyond you. I mean, this is where H. Richard Niebuhr is really good too. We can think about value theology, where God, that relationship provides an estimation of your own value too. That's a different understanding of how it is that spirituality and theology funds ethical life. That religion is not just about beliefs. It is about the trust that you form in a community, the leadership that you develop, the way that you talk about it, and how that your values can be deeply formed and perhaps even grounded in deep theology, heaven forbid. And that can lead to a different story that you talk about who you are. All of this we cover in Solidarity Circles. It's a competency-based curriculum. Storytelling for social change is one of them. Value-based organizing is the third one. Active listening is another one here. So those are three. And then liberating theology, which is one thing that we have not talked about this so far. As you build all of these great, strong institutions, you're doing it in a landscape dominated by power, just pervaded by power. And so you need to have solid power analysis about how it is you can get things done in your community, some material analysis of how it is that political and economic life actually work. So that was a lot, Trip, but I just your points here are right on.
Two things come to mind. One, there are ways within kind of traditional congregational life to start to connect narrative, values, and the community getting clear on the way its agency exists. Like you mentioned, and every church I've worked at, there is a whole budget for the things you give money to.
Exactly.
And oftentimes that is structured in a way that nonprofit leaders, anxious that their nonprofit will exist, show up and do presentations, hoping they get the right size check from groups. And in that same format can shift. When I got in charge of it, one of the things I did was say that, we're only going to be giving money to the organizations in our community that members volunteer at. And so I was like, we want members to be the ones that show up and pitch us about this. And there were lots of people who were not a part of the outreach group because they're actually busy volunteering that are now like, well, then I want to be a part of it. And then they come in and you actually hear what's going on in the community. And you're like, we should be actually putting more money into this. This is what's going on. And we actually have 3 or 4 families that are regularly volunteering here. And so then one of the retired school teachers that was on the community, that she's like, Trip, at the beginning of the school year, we do like the blessing of the school teachers and students. We should do that for all of our regular volunteers for nonprofits. And I was like, this is a great idea. And she's been a member of this church a long time. I can't get in trouble for this.
That's right.
Like, whose idea this was. So then,
that's right.
Like, just in narrating when you're reporting on your giving, if it shifts to your fellow church members who volunteer their time, and instead of, here's the good it does with some charts, but a particular narrative about another neighbor who we've blessed because we have now, in a sense, ordained these church members to represent us in the community, right? Things change. The next year at budget meeting, when I said, wouldn't it be nice if we spent more of our year budget on our neighbors than our organ because it had its own endowment. Like, I didn't get as many eye rolls because in their head, that line item was a whole bunch of their peers who spend their free time in these organizations and stuff like that. So, like, sometimes even, when you're thinking of those different parts of solidarity circles, oftentimes once you get a framework, you go, oh, 3/4 of this, we already actually have all the resources sitting there. You just need someone strategically to connect dots between stuff that's going on in the community, members that are already a part of stuff, and then how do we then orient the resources and passion of our community to be supportive of its very members that are doing these things in the community.
But
And it starts to change consciousness of the congregation.
You're exactly right. But that, your story of that, is a really happy one. But it's not always the case, right? There are many times when people try to make changes within their congregation and they realize that there are power relationships that are preventing them. That actually, say you've got a big church that is trying to become a reconciling in Christ ministry, and the pastors don't feel really super supportive of it. So how do you move that committee forward throughout the rest of the congregation while also recognizing that there are real power forces within your congregation that can put a stop to it? The point is, I think what solidarity circles allows individual leaders to do, pastors, lay leaders, clergy, organizers to do, is a couple of things. One is it breaks you out of your isolation. And it puts you in particular relationships with other people across the country who are doing similar things in similar contexts, or they're doing different things in different contexts and that you can learn from. That's the keys. It's one of my big things is not, pastors don't need just more friends, or people who experience burnout don't need more coffee, or chit chat. You need particular relationships that can help you solve the root of the problem. I like vacations. I'm a big fan of it. But if you go away on vacation and a fire's burning at your congregation and no one's there to put it out, the whole thing's going to be burnt down when you get back. So part of this is rest is only truly rest if you're able to then really radically transform the structure within what it is you're working in the first place. And so solidarity circles is about putting you in particular relationships and having certain conversations, specific conversations with the different people who are doing different things in different contexts around particular skills and knowledges, right? The anonymity of this, about the fact that you're going to talk to people from any different city from across the country, increases the reflexivity. Because one of the problems too is that if you try and square a circle or whatever, solve a problem at your congregation with the same people over and over again, they all share your same judgments about who the problem people are. They all understand about why it is that Travis is consistently a pain in the butt on this committee. But if you're a part of a solidarity circle,
Travis is a problem.
Yeah. I don't. I'm just trying to
He
go. He
probably recently retired and spends half the day checking his investments and the other half watching Fox News.
Exactly. Right. So but I don't know who Travis is. So you got to tell me who Travis is. You got to tell me why it is that he is. What's his story? What's his role? How can we move him? Right. And I am working with a congregation right now that is attempting to become a reconciling in Christ ministry. And we're going to lead them through listening campaign this summer to ground the movement of becoming a truly welcoming congregation in the deep values of that community so that can be more clearly articulated in the mission and vision of the congregation, which is a theological thing. Your story about your congregation in LA that all of a sudden sees its outreach budget as an extension of its membership is a theological point here. The church is now out in the community. That's the church. That's not just individuals. That's actually the expression of your mission. That's God's hands and feet out there. So that to me is really important too, is that if we just keep on having this secular or this, thin description of it about how to build a strong institution, build stronger relationships, it's not. We got to listen to the Spirit. We got to follow its call.
When you were talking about potential thickness and values, that potential kind of correlates to the thickness of the community itself.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier how like to have a community, it requires accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, as someone like looking at this historically and then working with leaders of different kinds of communities and different spaces, okay, well, I'll just say it as a hypothesis, and you tell me, should I continue to lose sleep of this or not?
Yeah.
But it seems that the margin for relational beholding is continuously thinning, right? So like one element of it is burnout, but when you think of all the things that are required for a thick community where that kind of accountability and value, shared value enactment happens, like just the amount of face time that you have with people is a part of it. The time that you have, but not just like having time together, but what kind of time. So there's like ritual time, threshold times, these kind of things. The way in which you occupy shared spaces, the number of spaces that haven't been occupied by market incentives is small. The number of relationships that aren't algorithmically mediated deteriorate. The number of friends people have are going down. Then you throw on like the question of narratives, like values are storied. Like you tell a story where you were caught up in, and so part of the horizon of possibility is oriented precisely because it's narrated, right? It's not some like just simultaneously enacted serial moments. It's the threads within them that are both communally constructed and inherited, and also dreamed, right? So like drawing threads between what we've inherited to where we can be.
Yeah.
And then you think of and this is the problem of Protestantism in general, but our iconoclasm in its early sense has in many ways de-ritualized or desacralized so many things, maybe to like the Eucharist or baptism, that that our liturgy doesn't presume a depth dimension about secular existence or material existence, and that's one thing when the shared narrative of your community is thicker. The moment there's a multiplicity of them, then that like lack of ritual, narrative, bonding, spatial, threshold, transition stuff goes down, and now you end up with a lot of people where we're always kind of a cacophony of identities, and we're negotiating them into the little spaces we're in. And so in a sense, I think the kind of techno-economic regime of the present has in many ways made the soil of relationships inhospitable to having deep roots.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes we're busting our head up against something, and it's not like accidental in the sense of, oh, we're just doing a bad job and this clergy or this church should feel like they're failing. It's no, you're running into a feature of a culture that decided engineers with investment bankers behind them were the best to solve problems and structure society.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, all those kind of collections of the thinning out of community are something we have to address and figure out how to negotiate at the same time we're thinking of like, what do we do with, the time and space that we have?
Amen. Yeah. I mean, I think that, there was a recent Atlantic piece that came out in the spring, right? The anti-social century, right? That just kind of tracks that and makes clear the threats to community and structured communities that we currently face. And the classic story is that this people look at Bella's Bella's work around the sort of individualization and the Sheilaism that we find, and then we look at Putnam and we look at Bowling Alone. But Putnam still has, an American Grace. He and Campbell have that story, right? That it's, and this is still the case, even in the Pew, and even in the most recent Pew data, right? Is that, yes, we have lots of threats towards the soil for community is pretty inhospitable. It's pretty shallow. It's rocky. You can't really grow a lot of good things in it. But there are a lot of people who still really want belonging and still really want community. That has not changed, right? That basic part of perhaps that aspect of anthropology hasn't shifted, it seems. The way we do community is different, and I don't think that we should have a nostalgia about wanting to go back to the 1950s and build a church around that too, right? So we need to recognize that we're in different times, and how it is that people express relationships and form them and nurture them are different. That's not a bad thing, right? Technology is not a bad thing. Social media is a tool that can enhance the community, as we are discovering and enacting right now. But here's the other part about it too. Your agricultural, your metaphor here around the soil is really important, because that's why, I mean, it's why people referred to, and Ella Baker referred to her organizing as spade work. It's hard, slow, patient work. Building relationships takes time. Very few things can replace the one-on-one, right? And the actual just human connection of it. This is part of the story of solidarity circles, right? We've had now 200 people, over 200 congregations that have gone through it. It started with 20, as like me basically asking all of my Presbyterian colleagues to, hey, come on and join. And they said yes, because I asked them to, right? And it was like, it was, okay, it's 5 Zoom calls. This is back when we just did it for 5 months. Now it's 9 months, monthly Zoom call, 90 minutes. We do a sort of pay what you can. We have a pricing model that we can go through, but we got a number of different things that we can meet, discount codes we can meet people at. But from that 20, then we became 40, because every one of those 20 people invited another one. And now we have people, now we're going to ask all of the people who've gone through to invite not just one, but 2 or 3. And there is a sort of tipping point about this. Part of the point here that I'm trying to make is, yes, there are a lot of threats to community life. Organizing and relationship building is slow and patient work. It's spade work. We have to understand that. It's good work. You also have to understand that the landscape has shifted. What is your particular role to play? Are you going to be the, congregation that worships 1,000, or are you going to be the one that worships 30? Both are good, right? Like, let's be clear about what sort of community you need to be. Because in that congregation of 1,000, there's probably a number of different congregations within that. And they play out against each other in different ways. So I think all of that is really clear, is that the work here is inherently good. And that I think there isn't a silver bullet, but also I don't think it's necessarily, we're not looking for like a Ludditism here. Yes, I've just been reading some of his work too, right? I think slow church is not the answer here, as Andrew Root kind of tells us. But there are ways in which we can build communities of power that value deep relationship and value it because we hold certain things dearly together. The final thing to say about this is part of the reason that communities increase with trust and have a better way to tell their story, right? That thickness of the value you talk about it is because values are not things that are out there, right? They're attitudes that we take up towards the world. And when I meet with other people and we explore the stories we have about why it is that we love our kids, or why it is that we love liberal theology, or why it is that we love these sort of things, right? Then we mutually deepen those attitudes and those judgments. And then my story now includes you. And so then that's the thickening of it, is that it's not about to kind of put it out there in the world, I think is a mistake. And instead we need to think about how does that I can increase, what's the story you're telling, how can I enrich it, and how can I be a part of it?
No, that's hopeful. But thinking about the rather impotency of mainline Christianity, that it's definitely not theologically liberal. In a deeply robust sense. But I'm kind of, tell me what was going through your head, because you already got to listen to or read me venting for 3,000 words. So, no, I was just wondering what if when you think about the predicament of theology's own role, like and really the task of both the academy and congregational leaders in thinking and articulating the faith in ways that this thicker value structure emerges. Like what's been the I don't know, what do you think the biggest hesitations or limits or weaknesses are
Yeah.
That you would point to? Because I mean, I think of
Yeah.
it like someone who was a philosopher of religion and then are thinking these questions, not like thinking of it in the congregational leadership or regularly working with people in different parts of the country, denominations and things as to
Yeah.
how that kind of fourth element of solidarity circles, the kind of liberative theological vision,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
you know,
No,
finds
this is
purchase in congregational life.
right. The double bind that you talk about, both in reference to Keller, and then does Bo talk about it in terms of the perfect storm? Right? Is the
Yeah, he was using the perfect storm
exactly
imagery. Yeah.
those? So okay, I think to me, yeah, they name at least two crises. One of theological education, broadly liberal, which is seminaries are declining, closing, merging, moving online. Right? There's the crisis of theological education, and there's the crisis of the mainline congregations. They're related, as Ted Smith wonderfully shows us in the end of theological education, like the story of clergy, of pastor as a profession comes with a particular voluntary society model of the congregation, which leads to the denomination, which then leads to the theological school, which then leads to professionalization, all of this sort of stuff. But then when you have all that sort of crumbling, right, when you have the individual voluntary society model of community sort of crumbling, the theological education model that which serves it and feeds from it is going to also crumble. Theological education, it's not all a horror story or whatever. It's not all, this is not a declination narrative, right? There is innovation consistently happening within the congregations and within theological education. The challenges that many theological education institutions place is still being a business, how you make money, right? This is just the reality of it, is that this is why the brick and mortar version of theological education is really facing a challenge, because you've got to pay $20,000, $30,000 a year to go live, say, in New York City or a city somewhere else, and then pay, all these sort of things. Just the sticker price is too expensive, right? And people don't have that. So you have you have those challenges facing brick and mortar. At the same time, you have many schools who are moving online, and you see lots of really interesting innovations that happen, say, with Kairos, say happens that what Fuller is doing, look at what Duke is doing, look at what Candler is doing. There are lots of different moments and different sorts of innovation, right, around adult education, right, around how is it that we continue to equip the saints without requiring them to get an MDiv. Why? Why don't we want to require them to get an MDiv? Because many denominations and pastors are deciding they don't need one anyways for the leadership that they need. Certified lay pastors, course of study. There are many different versions of theological education that will certify a pastor now for the local congregation. And those innovations, right, those changes and how it is that we develop and form leaders is really important, and things to learn from. Solidarity Circle emerges at this sort of intersection, right? It was started 5 years ago after I had all these different conversations with faith leaders, clergy, and organizers from across the country. And broadly, what I learned with these leaders is that they are over-resourced in terms of toolkits. Anybody can Google a particular Bible study on any topic, but what they cannot readily find are communities of praxis that can accompany them as they go about their social change work and help them ground it in their faith values. That's the need that Solidarity Circles were created to meet. And it provides that. It provides you with a community of praxis. It grounds the education, the content, and the skills that we provide you in your own context, because we require you to develop your own case study and present it to your colleagues here as you're working on it. And mutually so, other colleagues will do that with you, so you'll get a concrete example every time you meet one of these. It's not a 4-credit course with your church body or whatever, and make sure that you get some credit for this. But that's not the capital that we're trading. And we're trading in knowledge and relationships here, because that's what people really need. Because they're not getting this in course of study. They're not getting this in different forms of certified lay pastor adult education, because adult education broadly is a field that doesn't know how to do theological education. It doesn't really understand how to equip people or community organizing. It doesn't understand power analysis. doesn't understand how is it that you actually engage in developing leaders, right? By leading them through critical reflection around the story that they told about their congregation and their own role and what it might look like to tell a new story. In Solidarity Circles, we lead you through the process of how to do that, right? It's the how that is really important here. It's because you can get any other toolkit anywhere else, but it's the relationships and it's the certain sort of questions that we ask. So because of the perfect storm and because of the double bind, the mutual crisis that both of those are facing, there hasn't been this inflection point and centralization of this is the new non-degree, non-credit program that everybody's going to go for online. And I think that's a good thing. I think for a little bit, there should be a decentralization of versions. Beer Camp thrives because of that. When I went, I went and I thought it was the AAR, the American Academy of Religion, of the church, right? Not the academy, but this is where everybody wanted to be. And I'm an introvert, so I don't really like AAR, anyways. But it definitely felt there was a magnetism there. It's like, oh, this is where people want to be. No one in the academy.
It's always a reception.
It's always a reception. I love it. Exactly.
You don't have to wait till 9 o'clock to get free drinks.
Exactly. But do you see what I mean? I mean, because there's not a centralization of it, this allows for the emergence of new forms of adult faith formation and equipping and building congregations that aren't beholden to the particular models of theological education or the congregation. That's okay. Because actually, within the PCUSA, where's the place where it's growing the most? In the 1001 new worshiping communities. That's where people agree. So it's new forms of communities. That doesn't necessarily mean it's leaving the old congregation behind, but it's doing something new with it. Maybe it's meeting its building. Maybe it's using its staff in different ways. Maybe it's 2 congregations in one. Maybe it's an ECLA congregation and a PCUSA congregation that share a building. Like, I think that it's the newness of this inflection point, which is really important. And that one needs to that Solidarity Circles intervenes in and provides particular skills and knowledge and relationships that are otherwise missing.
Yeah. One element that has become increasingly clear to me in the variety of institutions I've worked at is for seminary education, the move to online, be it, virtual classes or kind of the asynchronous ones and these kind of things, while, there's been all this accommodation at the Association of Theological Schools for it, the ungraded loss just doesn't exist, right? Like it has not been accounted for. So, I had intuitions toward it, but I thought maybe this is just because Tripp would prefer to sit in a seminar room for 3 hours twice a week with the same people while you read text slowly. And that's just his personality. But, when we moved online at the University of Edinburgh during lockdown, the very same class I taught the semester before is now online with the same quality of students.
Yeah.
And the outcomes were significantly different.
Yeah.
And then after COVID and, there were more, that experiment turned into a justification probably to make up for lost income at a lot of schools to extend online stuff. But if you just go 5 years apart, let's read all the final essays. The difference is significant. And, the main thing that got cut was not, they were both had the same professor reading the same text. And theoretically, I should have gotten better at teaching it. But the outcomes were worse. And I think that in-person space and the longevity of relationships you get when you have 3 years in the same place plays a very significant role, right? And one of the responses has been, because of the economic pressure that you point out, is like, we want to be one of the schools that survive, so let's adapt, go online or do this and move here. And you can still do the same assessment, probably read half as much and write half as much, and that kind of thing. Interesting fun fact, there's been a couple recent studies that the psychological burden of reading and writing for classes where you don't have peers that their names just feels bigger. So it's not even like, students are worse and our attention span, blah, blah, blah. But there's the commitment to the community changes when you aren't going to sit in a room with people. But so like there's been this, we want to survive, so let's come up with a rationale to remove this, especially when we don't have the income to support students to move here, live here, all that kind of thing. But something like solidarity circles, like what, when I realized this, taking seriously the gathering time at Theology Beer Camp, that so much more of it, there's lots of content, more than any normal person wants to engage, but the actually being in a room for 3 days with people that you have these digital relationships with, and creating ways of connecting locally, affinity groups, these kinds of things. But seeing as like that's an element that's starved, that even if you have invigorating ideas, it's not till they become they come to like occupy space in relationships that they become material or become reality. And so that's been one of the things, just in following along on the journey of what y'all have done with solidarity circles, and hearing back from people that heard about it on the podcast join, and then they name it, like clergy going, it's like you now have people that become friends, that you're talking about what is it like to be a faith leader with these passions in this community, and they're getting to know my community and helping me think through it as I'm getting to know theirs. And two different people just give it reminded me of like those best classes at seminary. And so I do think you're naming something that's really important, that the general double bind problem that Catherine raises, right? Like that theologians work and get on the cutting edge of their discipline, and then they lose constituencies in traditional religious communities.
That's right.
And you have this kind of like this gap. Before that gap, the fusion happened in the relationships that future clergy, and then they have relationships in their denomination, because most people went to the same denomination schools.
That's right.
They show back up at continuing ed and all that. And over time, denominational loyalty, we move a lot more. All these things kind of made that web of relations break. So if the very space that a student of Catherine, who's like peak philosophical theology, doing poetics that requires intense, slow reading to learn to do it. But if you know plenty of her students, ones in congregations and stuff, you'll hear her brag about how they made palpable ideas she's been wrestling with. And she's like, she'll tell me like, they said this or did this. You got to listen to this sermon. Like I wouldn't have never thought about putting it this way. But it's one that could have never been done if they hadn't been in her theology class, right? So to me, one of the possibilities of something like solidarity circles, what I hope happens at camp, and these other kind of, of ways of building relationships is like, how do you create relationships among individuals with these shared values, where that reciprocity kind of generates an inertia to then get to know your own context, setting and stuff, and embody or live it out.
I mean, I think your point here around time is really important, right? Like it's usually about by the third solidarity circle when there's a fork in the road, and then people feel comfortable being vulnerable with each other. So it's about time and investment, about participants within the program and building relationships with others, right? That they make a decision that this is a community that they want to form, right? It's a time-bound community for 90 minutes for 9 months, right? So this is in their calculation of their investment. That's kind of what's not too overwhelming. It's not a 3-year program, something like this. So I think that's really important, right? It's also by good facilitation. I really do think that, the work then of the facilitators of solidarity circles, it's an art to be able to meet, to recognize, to see, to affirm, to probe, to push, to engage, people, and to take seriously their context, and to take them as sources of authority and around the state of and the future of their own ethical community. All of that is that's a different sort of relationship, right? That's not just a chit chat of, how things are going at your church. Like, this is really hard. Yeah, things are hard. The question is, how do we engage in a conversation that can help us identify and correct the hard things in the first place, right? And human relationships are complicated, and so it does take time. Okay, so that's the solidarity circle part about it, that like, yes, you have to form these relationships, that it's, as much as the content and the skills that we provide you with are a crucial aspect of this, so is the relational aspect of it. It's not going to stick unless you have those relationships that can kind of embed them or implot them in the narratives that you tell about yourself, right? So you've got to be able to plot this out as part of your theological formation, of your pastoral formation, as a leader in your community. Also, all of that. And that's through relationships. That's got to stick. But your point here then about broadly, like, solidarity circles is so here's one thing about it. It's basically, it's one iteration of a program, right? There are lots of different circle formats of meeting, right? Now, the content and the facilitation is unique. But there's lots more that we can dig into. We have conversations around the solidarity economy and the cooperative economy, and yet we're developing trainings now, one in Kansas City, one in Memphis, another one in Stony Point, New York, where we're digging deeper around how it is you build cooperative economies into your congregation. And that's going to be in person. Because, Tripp, as you're talking about and narrating this, the lovely experience of the seminar classroom, which I totally resonate with. It was a sad day when I realized that I will never again experience that closeness of the theological education seminar classroom of 12 people really digging into a text and really pointing, really focusing on a paragraph. Those are unique and valuable points. But the question that I have is what is theological education for? It's not for one thing, because there are many different types of theological education. Not everybody likes to read Whitehead, Tripp. Sorry.
Sad.
I know. It's real. So not everybody's going to want to join you for those 3-hour seminars. But there are other people who really care about the future of their congregation and want to go through the course of study and need to get certified as a lay pastor in order to continue preaching and serve. So the different forms of theological education, we need a number of different tools in our toolbox in order to actually really address and begin constructing the new edifice of what the church is to come. Solidarity Circles is one iteration of it. It's not the only thing that we're going to build. We're going to build other things because the needs of communities are different and they change, and we need in person. Any good hybrid program will tell you, in order to really create community online, you need to meet in person first. That's what everyone does. They meet in person for an intensive, and then you have 6 months online, then you come back. So theological education is not for one thing. And that's good because the crises that we face have a number of different sources, and we need everybody here to help us address them.
This is a slight detour, but in my head, it's one of the questions that runs through the whole conversation.
Yeah.
It seems to me that as mainline Protestantism became decentered culturally, where it both had moral victories that then just were internalized largely into the nation, and ceased to be culture dominant, that it as it dissipated, it also lost the energy or potential for revolution and mostly seeks reform. And then the significance of that reform is smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
Right. And you think of that, the Rosa Luxemburg piece where, people on the left generally argue about whether reform or revolution makes sense. And I brought that question up often with, in class with a bunch of divinity students. And it's fascinating to me how allergic mainline Protestants are to what's necessary is revolution of some sort.
Well, yeah.
Right. And so, generally what they're thinking is, and what they count as revolution, I'm not sure either one of us would, but nonetheless. But then I said, well, yeah, but we did get to a point where that was exactly what we thought was the case when it came to slavery, right? Like the only viable option was revolution. Like being an abolitionist was the correct move, even if it meant using the structures of the state to impose the alienation of future value and property from a large number of citizens. And it's not like there wasn't a large movement to go, well, let's reform this. Can't we make sure we feed the slaves well and house them well? Can we not break up families? Like, these are actual laws that were passed, right? And was it a positive thing not to break up families of human beings you own and count as 3/5 a person? I guess, but like, would you call it good? And so like, you think of that versus when we get to the New Deal and these kind of things. There's all this progress that happens in that reform time, but then, more or less since the end of the 70s on, it's been slowly undone, now generating so much pressure when it goes to the growing wealth gap, power gap, anxiety, all the way down to just thinking our contemporary moment and a budget that's going to give tax cuts to billionaires while feeding less people, or charging the working poor extra money for their kids' physicals. Like, that's what we need. Anyway. So to me, one of the difficult things is not like, oh, I think we always have to do revolution and screw you guys. It's that the imagination of the church is at this point is so muted that even its wildest dreams are ones that may never call into question what is currently under the law and economic system rendered as natural. And what if what's rendered as natural is exploitative in our grandkids' future, well, at least I hope so, as looking back 2 generations after slavery and going like, what the hell were they thinking?
Exactly.
Like, what do you mean? Oh, we didn't break up families? That was a good reform? And so I when you mentioned earlier that bit about liberal Christians no longer making space to be addressed by the word, become uncomfortable with the demand of a transcendent one who both loves us and desires and calls forth justice. To me, part of where that comes from is being more attached to the privilege that's in a system that privilege is just protected by saying reform and reform alone. Right? Never revolution. Revolution, that's not what we do, because we're inherently conservative, even if we don't admit it, because we got a pride flag on the front of our church.
Yeah. I mean, this is and should be your next book trip, right? This is the problem here, right? The problem of a thin theological imagination. You're better with titles or whatever. But yeah, I think this is exactly right, is that our theological and political imaginations have been frustrated and starved. And I think that broadly, institutions do have a sort of, institutions, the structures of them have a sort of preservationist sort of attitude, turning inward. And once they scale up so big, then it ends up being kind of like, well, there's a self-preservation. When everything else is kind of crises, they've got to make sure that they're okay. Which, I mean, anthropologically, I kind of get that. Yeah, I get that. And you're seeing the fallout of that. I mean, again, look at all the mainline denominations and the crises that they're going through just financially because of the declining memberships and congregations and all sorts of things, right? Is that there's the institutional now contraction that's happening. But what comes with that is the real, starvation of a theological imagination. I sort of refuse to believe that there are not, that theological imagination, that there are not spaces and environments of radical, innovative, exciting, robust theological imagination happening. Dreamers, right, are there. Let's find them, let's engage them, let's create structures that allow us to dream together. Victoria Walcott has this really great book that talks about some of the purpose of utopias, right? And, so this is part of what's important about this. If you look at some of the examples that she has, there are two really important examples that are relevant to solidarity circles here. One of them is labor and labor schools in the 1920s and cooperative farms, right? These were radical. So here's one story about it that is related to mainline liberalism, which is really great. So I'll try to tell it very quickly. There are three main figures, maybe four, out of Vanderbilt Divinity School in the 1920s and 1930s who are identified with the radical social gospel movement, right? And the social gospel, as Gary kind of defines it, right here, is transforming the structures of society in the direction of social justice, right? So the idea that salvation is both social and individual, that Christianity has a ethical call, that it has deep concerns about social issues and concern for the world, that the kingdom of God and the cooperative commonwealth are synonymous in transforming those economic and political structures, that is a work worthy to engage in. I'm not certain whether people actually, any of the main theologians, believe that it was possible to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth. Rauschenbusch talked about the kingdom of sin as much as he did about the kingdom of heaven. Like there's deep tragedy within many of the social gospelers, and so we need to get clear on that. But three of the main figures who came out of Vanderbilt were Howard Kester, Alva Taylor, and Claude Williams. What's really important about all three of these figures is that they were also all deeply engaged with the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas that was beginning around the 1930s to 1940s. This was a cross-racial, class-based movement of tenant farmers who were organizing against some of the most powerful forces, really, of political and economic domination within the United States, because tenant farmers were essentially, many of those tenant farmers and many people who wrote about them equated their role with slaves because they got paid in scripts that they paid to the company store. The plantation owners were also the judiciary. They were also the political rights. They were also like every aspect of their social life and their political life and their economic life was controlled by planters. And they were on plantations because the plantation economy was real and still very much with us around that. Sherwood Eddy, right? One of the most important philanthropists and mainline liberals within the 1930s and 40s and 50s. I think it was Kirby Page and Sherwood Eddy who first got Niebuhr involved in the social gospel movement, and they really introduced him to the global movement and took him on one of these trips to see Europe and kind of expanded his political and theological imagination. Kester brought Eddy down to Southern Tenant Farmers Union to show him the importance and the work that's happening through the Southern Tenant Farmers Union and the work that they were doing through radicalizing, their economic life. Eddy was, just thrilled with this. And Kester said the first thing that he would really like to do is to buy up a plot of land and create it into a cooperative farm where people would grow and own their own land and own their own food and run a business there. Eddy fronted the money. They purchased the land. Delta and Rochdale Farms were two cooperative movements that happened in the 1930s and 1940s in the Mississippi Delta that were ultimately closed. They don't exist anymore. But here's the main point about it for me, is that a liberal like Eddy is somebody who's playing a crucial role in providing for the institutional support to make these radical dreams come true. Part of this, it seems to me, about theological imagination is not just about whether you're for reform or whether you're for revolution. The big part is how do we build transitionary structures to make revolution possible? How do we get away from the exploitive and extractive form of the economy that we have right now? What can we actually do right now? How can a congregation actually adopt strategies of the solidarity and cooperative economy now in order to build economic power for itself and for marginalized communities that actually begin to move themselves away from capitalism and away from extractive and exploitative forms of the economy? You don't do it right away. You start by building slow movements of transition away from it, and it takes all sorts of people. it takes, it takes a Sherwood Eddy, somebody who you would think is somebody who's just who's the most mainline liberal of all of them. And yet he's the one who's making the utopic dreams really possible. So I just think that that's like that story about how radical movements were funded by mainline liberals is really important, because it can show us that it's going to take all of us, and that there are differentiated roles for us to play. Politics of purity aren't going to cut it, because then you're not going to have a team to build with in the first place. And they're all going to look like you and sound like you. So I think that, yeah. So, but anyways, you do need to write that book, right? The thinness of political imagination, and how is it that we can actually solve the problems that we're facing today?
Well, that's a significant homework assignment.
Yeah, right.
How have you thought about the seeming muteness of, like, the selective muteness of mainline Christianity? Like, even on places where, even if you polled their constituents, their shared value commitments, but like whether it speaks, or there are places where the denominations may have, made statements on something, but then it never shows up at the pulpit. And especially like considering the last, the last 18 months or so with everything in Palestine, the moral ambiguity around discussing it, even to this day, just seems
flabbergasting.
Yeah, and not just in the sense of how depressing it is, but how even the dominant. I don't even see people that are, let's say that in good faith they would just see things in a Zionist type way for whatever reason. I don't know. I was a Jimmy Carter Baptist, so I guess my internal prejudice was never had that as a live option. But to then utilize the logic of like protecting people from anti-Semitism and stuff to like silence things, or I mean, the number of clergy who I know that have slightly raised the issue and then gotten dynamic pushback from, congregation members around that, it just makes me think whatever insulation exists around a conscience that would hate to be disturbed for mainline Protestants is rather thick.
Hasn't it always been, though? I mean, like, this is partly my question.
Yeah, okay.
You're kind of asking me that, but it's also like, all right, Tripp, when has the center ever been for, the utopic? When have like, that's, I'm not asking this facetiously. I want, like, do you have examples where, can we go back to a time when we were like at the civil rights movement? Well, it's like, well, actually the mass majority of congregations weren't for the civil rights movement and Black freedom movement. Abolitionists. Actually, that was not a clear-cut issue. Lots of white congregations were for slavery. And actually, we can kind of make the argument that, the Civil War was just as much around the economy and had less to do with race and actually like white people's good-heartedness, and instead was more around the economic self-interest. So I do think that like we can complicate this enough to sort of say, what exactly are we asking for?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess part of it is if you ask most mainline Protestants about their denomination or the tradition, they're going to raise up as heroes the Minority Report from their tradition, right? As like, this is who we emulate, even though like people in that congregation at that time were the white moderates that Martin Luther King was chastising from the Birmingham jail.
Sure, yeah,
but
exactly.
that same congregation today is like, oh, we love Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, yeah,
and
right.
And insert, you could go through, the history of those spaces. So I wonder, but also like, just think of how that shift happened the moment you saw kids getting like wiped out with fire hoses, and then you just sit there and look at starving kids in Palestine, and you're like, okay, like, well, When do you get moved? And maybe I'm just
No,
too
I think
optimistic,
that
Aaron.
I think two things about this. The first is like, yeah, it's always easy to tell a story about who we were as our best selves, right? It's always
That's why I have a therapist.
Yeah,
so that I
exactly,
can
right? Yeah, but
convince him every week.
yeah, but it's always great to be like, oh yeah, the PCUSA has always been really progressive, and it's like, no, it hasn't. And like part of this is, and the examples that we're holding up come from movements, come from many different people. And so part of the problem is like when we tell the stories of who we want to be, we tell them as individualistic stories, not as communities. So I wonder if things will shift if we start telling stories about movements and about communities that came together that did different things. So rather than saying like, so the example that I gave of Sherwood Eddy actually is a really bad one then, because it's like, I don't want a bunch of rich people to kind of like just, that's actually not what I'm looking at. Part of that point was just to say that there are like, differentiated roles that we can play within this. But I do think if we get rid of the great men narratives, things shift. And we start talking about Septima Clark, start talking about Ella Baker. We start talking about, the movements that made possible the stories of King that we tell. That's a less glamorous sort of story. But it actually is like, that gives people handholds. Then you can start climbing. Then it starts to make sense about what it is that they can do. We worked with one congregation where there's simply the basic point here was that they have an endowment that's pretty small, but that every year they get about $30K to give into the community. And we helped them develop particular standards to make sure that the basis of which they're giving that money was developed and grounded in the solidarity and the cooperative economy. Even just that institutional shift to alternative values of economic life and economic power then begins to transition the structure. That's not a great, that's not incredible, but it's something. And it's really important because it's a long-term sort of story here. And that's about transitionary structures. That's about, each different move that you make.
Do you wonder, like, to me, one of the things that amplifies the flabbergasted nature of my soul because of what's going on in Palestine is that I think that like there's video for that, and then if we take what the coming crisis is going to be around the ecological crisis,
this is
forced migration, water, food, all these other kinds of things. I just think if a video of a starving kid where food is sitting on the other side, but a state won't let them give it to them, doesn't animate something, then
what will?
Like, how straightforward does the violence of something have to be to move someone in a way that as a collective we, demand action? I guess that to me is like, I always have this thought, like, as a theologian, it was real important to me when the second time I was writing a Christology book to make sure like ecological questions are woven into the way you articulate the gospel, both because those questions are important for today, and it's hard to say the phrase good news if there's nothing in response to the most pressing questions, right? And so like then to go, oh, well, responding to the ecological crisis like requires some way in which communities are seized to the dignity of others they'll never meet, and whose reality almost always gets presented in a graph or a mass migration or something like that, rather than some very specific narrative that you can usually pull out for most of the crises that exist within a given community. And so the public art of moral imagination seems to have a unique challenge as we're simultaneously flooded with images of things and increasingly distanced from kind of like material contact with the other whom we have deep relations with, be it economically, politically, and such.
Yeah, I think
And so, like, what is it like to cultivate a social imaginary for that world is a particular challenge.
And I think that's right. I mean, yes, it is because of those two, that another double bind that you're talking about here, those two crises. Part of at least for me, is making sure that we're clear what it is we're asking of from whom, right? And from what? Like, are the institutions that we're looking for actually built to respond in the way that we want them to respond? Like, so that's one question. Are we telling and amplifying the stories of radical Christian witness for free Palestine in the way that we should and that we can? If we're not, okay, we need to amplify them and make sure that those stories are out there just as much. So it's a kind of like a strategic question, because I do think, you're going to get deflated if you expect people who are, I'm not this sort of media scholar, right? But I do think, we're inundated, and so a video doesn't have the same impact as it did when during the civil rights movement, right? Like, TV was a new form of media. Now in the media age, like, the image is not as provocative, not as powerful. Partly, think about like artificial intelligence and the way that you can play with images and the truth about all of this. So I think that's a strategic question for me.
Or the way a member of your cabinet can play with them, and then you just believe it's true.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. And it's like, this is the whole thing about what exactly do we believe is true in the first place. Yeah. So I do think it's a strategic one. Like, I think there are a number of colleagues that I have who are organizing with Christians for a free Palestine, and they're doing really important work. And I don't want to downplay at all the challenges and the thickness of the insulation on the moral imagination of mainline Protestantism, particularly around Zionism and around Palestine. But I do think for me, it's a strategic question, because I find that to be the case with many different social change issues. It's about relationships. What do they care most about? What are they willing to, people organize because they care deeply about the world. It's those stories that throw them into the fight in the first place. So let's engage them on those stories, rather than thinking that if we can do it backwards, that if we just get them in the movement, then they'll form, No, I think that's the wrong order of goods here. We've got to think about how things actually happen.
So I have two ideas that I put on my notes document.
Yeah, great.
So I want to try them out on you, and you tell me what I'm missing.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'm just going to have to send it to you in an email, and then you'll have to do it then.
Let's do it.
But one of the features that I think, especially for members of the middle class who now see their kids and grandkids as part of a precarious middle class.
Yeah.
The things that short circuit their ability for moral reasoning. And part of it is we've switched from believing kind of our cultural acceleration in all its forms that drives the economic and cultural move and all this kind of thing. We've switched from thinking it's moving us towards a hopeful future to thinking, but now it's moving us from an ongoing apocalypse that was seeded by the past. Economic, ecological, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's also whole elements of the alienation of the past where people broadly on the left have no idea how to tell a discerning story of their past that both acknowledges its disasters and dignities.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So we alienate from our past and kind of claim a collective victim status, which is us as alienated from our future, mostly by baby boomers. But that's really not integral to what I was saying. That's just occasionally I've been about baby boomers.
That's real.
But I was trying to think of what are the features of democracy in our kind of accelerating context that are problematic. And I haven't come up with names for them, but here are the four, and you can tell me like, oh, those ones make more sense to me or whatever.
Perfect.
Like one is, if democracy isn't just about taking a position, but the art of taking, forming, listening, reforming to get to solutions across difference, then it's inherently a deliberative process and not a performative one. And our public square is increasingly performative tribal incentives sabotage deliberation, right, into the cancel and purity expectations on both sides. It in many ways creates a world without neighbors and an increasing antagonism. And so the part of the problem, like one, is just a cultural fit problem. Like democracy, there are all these elements. It might have been tied to a print society. It might have been tied to all these other kinds of things. So what do we do? The second one is that in our age, the time needed for democratic decision-making is actually increasing as the world becomes more complex, faster, and dynamic. So how do you make democratic decisions around, say, immigration? Or the ecological crisis? Or reindustrialization of the middle of the country? Like, there are all these things, even places where you have shared commitments across political parties. The time needed to do it is growing, and yet there are more things that we have to take into account and more perspectives and voices in order to do it. And so like at the time, the scale of response needed is shrinking. The scale of listening and deliberation is expanding. And so there's this kind of like pool that you go, oh, this is another reason you can see people on both sides going, oh, democracy might be the problem. We might not, we're burning out economically. Now we are going to burn down our institutions because they require this. The problems are real. They're more, so let's abrogate the Constitution. Let's blah, 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 blah. The third feature is like our culture it's become increasingly diverse and less traditional. Now you have a culture without a monologic or a dominant expression. And so, which is, generally for America and on its best days, one of its assets, right? Like, bring us your poor, but it also means that there is so much less that can be assumed. So like the starting place for any deliberative democratic process now is including gigantic tensions. And the Andreas Rexrigg, the sociologist, talks about kind of the post neoliberal cultural shift is one where the kind of old line middle class and the precarious working class, on the top of the working class, like they have a kind of culturalization that becomes agonistically conservative because all the proliferation of difference is experienced as a threat to its identity, while there's a kind of hyper-culturalization for the new middle class or upper middle class of the cultural creative types, where particular singularity and uniqueness is attached to the individual. And so you have this proliferation of identities. It's celebrated, it's cosmopolitan, while the others, the singularities, the collective national or ethnic identity, and it sets up for this war of differences. And yet the logic of both of them find the other one so morally abhorrent, the idea of getting to know the other and deliberate becomes problematic. So you end up with a place like us where we're stuck in a culture war all the time. And then me and you are sitting there going like, okay, but could we talk about some class issues? Because, the third of everyone's presidential campaign speech that it was the same is the third none of you are going to act on because you're both purchased by the same people. But that sense that cultural diversities, we become less traditional, so there's no there's not like a receptacle. And so that task just becomes so hard. And then we have these kind of polarizing constellations. And then the last one is more of our decisions have a longer and irreversible horizon and actually deserve more deliberation. Genetic engineering, AI, nuclear ecology, or whatever. And so to then go, we have these longer and irreversible horizons here, while all these cultural features problematize democracy. I'm like, oh, maybe Plato had a point in the Republic,
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, I've just been trying to think about this because my natural tendency is one I try not to perform regularly, which is make sweeping, exaggerated, dismissive statements to people that don't see the obvious truth that is in front of me.
No, Trip, you are a big picture thinker here, right? This is a grand narrative. This is classic Trip. I really like this. Yeah, I think your first point is right. Democracy is inherently deliberative. I mean, I think it's democracy is about formation, about character and attitudes and who it is we are together as much as it is and how it is we are together. Those sort of qualitative questions are really important. To do that at the scale that we're at is a bigger. It's incredibly difficult, right? But I also think too, I don't think that democracy like needs to be nostalgized or like it's it's got to be best in the town hall when it like. I don't know. I think in some ways, like decentralization of the internet is there are aspects of that are really, really democratic, and we need to think about that. So I think that's right. I think your second point here, which was, what was your second point again? You hit for it.
That if like as the world becomes more complex, faster, more dynamic, the time needed for democratic decision making increases, and that time. It's all increasing. At the same time, you have more perspectives and voices and lived experience to take account for.
Diversification and the weightiness of the decisions. Yeah. I think that makes sense. I mean, I think this is like thinking then about this is then where conversations around heart and negri become really important. How do we do this at a global level? How do we think about the role of the nation state, about the forms of politics that we're talking about? I think that's right. And again, I think this is, we need to then think about the institutions, the collectivities. How is it? What are the decision-making bodies that we can set up? You mentioned accountability about, a while back too, right? Well, this is part and parcel of, I think, the very crisis of liberal democracy, which is around representation and accountability. What does it actually mean to represent? Who are representatives? How do we have a representative democracy? What is that about? So I think the trick here with some of the crises and aspects of democracy is that you're actually bringing in different forms of the democratic tradition. The first one here is very, very much about deliberative democracy and about the local community. The second here is about a different tradition that James Tully out of Canada would have lots of really interesting liberal theory to talk about here in terms of representative, democracy and constitutionalism and thinking about that. This Bonnie Honig wrote this book. I can't exactly remember what the book is, but she essentially makes the inherent problem of democracy is that whether the people will actually ever be ready for democracy. Like the people are never actually, they haven't arrived. And so democracy is very much an ideal as much as an actual state. It's something that you're striving towards. The third point here that you're talking about, I think, was one of like, these bigger, you're talking about, again, like we're now, I'm going to really simplify it. We're not the melting pot, we're the salad bowl, but all these different pieces perhaps don't go well together, but we need to include them all in order to make sure that we have actually democratic. Like, what do we do when the decision-making body is more diverse, both in terms of its experiences and in terms of its beliefs? I think, again, there's lots of different structures that we can think about. I'm about to go to this conference here on Wednesday that's looking at the Catholic Church, both in terms of being a synodal church. What are the structures that we can set up that actually consistently engage the people and the congregation? Community organizing does this really well. Again, questions of accountability and representation. Your last point here, though, around all of a sudden someone invents human consciousness. It's like, this is right. I don't do a whole lot. That's partly there's only so much time that I have in a day, right? But I do think that this is really important for us to think about. What do we do when the ramifications of quickly made decisions are, beyond even our imagination? I think this is again, maybe this is the book after you do the one on theological imagination. This is the one on like, what happens if you invent human consciousness? I mean, I think that I'm also like, how do I raise two good kids? How do How do you do that on a day-to-day level? How do you become a part of a church and a congregation that is for free Palestine? How do you do that in a landscape that's really challenging? I think there are a lot of really important decisions, and that I am really glad that you're asking that question.
Well, and one of the reasons, I have like my ongoing notebook of stuff I'll eventually come back to once there's enough there. But why I wanted to bring it up is when I think of what places like solidarity circles, or what happens in movement politics and community organizing, so much of that actually assumes the diversity of voices and lived experience and recognition of whatever the particular challenge is, as that's the starting point of what happens. And so much of what has happened to the public square politically has shifted from a deliberative framing to a performative one. I feel like one of the gifts solidarity circles, community organizing, and such in general do is it actually gives people the experience of being a part of a deliberative process.
Yes.
And when you're a part of one, it sets up for you to actually have more reasonable expectations of what happens when you're doing it with the entire country
and experiences to draw on. Like, oh my gosh, I actually have to sit across in a decision-making body with somebody who believes differently than me. Okay. And we're at odds on this on this issue. So how do we come together, and how do we navigate that, right? How do we build relationships across and, within deep differences? Yeah. Community organizing gives you that, and, at the local level, it can provide, the consistent challenges of how does it scale up? How does it match, a fast age, technologicalized, neoliberal racial capitalism? Yeah. These are all really difficult questions, but I do think that your very first question about how at the heart certain forms of democracy, for me, I think like in listening to the spirit in the book, right, which is not what we're talking about, but I kind of take the stance of I'm identifying with radical democracy, with a tradition that looks at how is it that we're forming the local relationships together, then how do we build institutions to allow them to scale up? That's, similar to agonistic and deliberative forms of democracy, right? These are different distinctions that we're going to make, and they, the polities shake out differently as you do that. But solidarity circles and community organizing offers people a laboratory of social change where they can focus on building certain relationships that don't exist out there in regular society, and actually that they need in order to solve many of the problems that they're facing today. So some of these are around, having just basic competencies around active listening, around organizing, around storytelling, and around analyzing material and class analysis of power. But some of it is also just building relationships across difference. And how do you hold that? I think that's incredibly important, because those skills and characters are applicable to other environments.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, okay, you before I go, you mentioned a number of different books as we went along.
Yeah.
If people are interested in kind of thinking more about movement, organizing, the different kind of like historical references or thinkers that you've mentioned,
sure.
Are there, or which ones would you kind of point people to?
Yeah. So there's a new volume coming out that Gary Dorian, Charlene Steclair, and I edited called Organizing Visions that'll come out in the fall. And that'll give you a wonderful historical arc of community organizing and theological education around social ethics as a field. And so that'll give you some of the basic history, then even up into the contemporary movements today. So that's one. I can send that to you, Trip. Another one here, if you're interested on race or on labor and religion, Jörg Rieger's Unified We Are a Force is really good. Along with his most recent one, Theology in the Capitalocene. These are good ones that help you think about questions of theology and forms of power, right? Especially in our age. So he can maybe help you answer those AI questions. That's not necessarily me. American Democratic Socialism is a book by Gary Dorian that will give you one of the most comprehensive accounts of the American Democratic left. And the role of religion in that. It's just a phenomenal tome. It's very good, along with some of his, huge books here around the Black social gospel and the white social gospel. He's got a trilogy around the Black social gospel and my book then around community organizing and congregational work, congregational development, listening to the Spirit, is going out, or has been out for a while now. But also, if you just want to talk about this, join Solidarity Circles. It's consistently going. Like, we'll drop you the link. We can give you some information about it. You'll schedule a meeting with me, and we'll get to know what your situation is and how we can help. So I think as much as reading, it's actually having a conversation partner with others for 9 months about these ideas, and they can help you develop strategies and tactics to take action together.
Yeah, and we'll put the links and stuff on the post and such, so people can check out the Solidarity Circles. But
and what are your books here that you would throw in here? What do we got for you, Trip?
Oh, I mean, the one that kind of set off the essay thing I sent to you was Christian Smith's new book, Why Religion Went Obsolete.
Good.
Which I found really fascinating.
Yeah.
Hartmut Rosa's newest book, Why Democracy Needs Religion, is stellar. It's also like super short, and he got invited to speak to some big European clergy conference.
Whoa.
And I really enjoyed it. And then I went to an event that he was speaking at Princeton in the fall, where I got to interview him and things.
Whoa.
And so it was, I like his work quite a bit.
Okay.
And I just got this new book. I told when I was talking with you and Gary yesterday, and now I'm a bit upset. The Structure of World History.
Yeah.
And it, from modes of production to modes of exchange, it is like one of the most fascinating modifications of Marx around like the places a process person would naturally be more suspicious of the finality of Marx's account.
Yeah.
Right. So when you switch modes of production to modes of exchange, you're like reintroducing layers of relationality to have causal efficacy that a traditional Marxist account doesn't. And then what he does, and this is similar to what you mentioned earlier about Negri's Empire, the books of like thinking, oh, well, what does this look like when there's the relationship of the nation and state and capital?
Yeah.
And he kind of like develops this historical narrative of exchange as it moves kind of like into agrarian, into industrial, like talking about the different ways power and exchange work, and then how kind of like industrial capitalism reorients the relationship of nation, state, and capital. And then what do you do when you isolate the three and do power analysis on all three? What are the resources from the past and its limits to then think about, and he's arguing for a form of associationism for the present. And he uses Kant's Kingdom of Ends as like a touch point for like rethinking through the relationships. And anyway, he takes a reading of Kant and Hegel back into Marx for fun ways. Also, a rather, I found, really compelling rereading, and you'd have to track through the footnotes. It's not like in one section.
Sure.
Of the master-slave dialectic, and like how like Hegel uses it, how Marx uses it, how Kojève uses it.
Yeah, exactly.
And like the history of its interpretation.
Oh my God,
and he basically wants to like invert the whole thing. Like he's like, oh, you watch the Marxist tradition continues to double down in this kind of materialist reading, and so he wants to like flip it again to reintroduce essentially like the function of relations, culture, and stuff back into it. And
I love that. That's good. A lot of good ethical Hegelian work is kind of in that way. Robert Williams does that. I love that stuff. So maybe I actually will get this. And I just pulled it up on my phone.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I mostly just say that so that someone else will read it.
Okay,
so I can.
I'll read it, and we can talk about it.
I have that. Like we mentioned earlier, there's nothing quite as much fun as being in a seminar.
Dude.
If you're a nerd with people reading a text together.
That's right.
Well, let's just say if you play on the internet professionally.
Exactly. Which you definitely do.
Then you're not in a seminar room very often, and then usually talking to other people about their book. It's hard to be like, well, about this one paragraph.
Well, one of these days, let's actually just like not do it about a separate topic, but actually just do it about your stuff and your questions. That would be fun.
All right. I like talking to you. Looking forward to seeing you again at
thanks.
camp and digitally before then.
That's right, man. Thanks, Trip.
Sweet.